I could afford retirement. That's the strange part. I had the pension, enough savings, a house that was finally paid off. I spent 41 years working maintenance at the same paper mill in Oregon. I rarely missed a day. I spent my whole life doing what I thought I was supposed to do. Work hard, save your money, plan for retirement, and eventually you'll get to enjoy life. At least, that's what I believed. Then life had other plans. My wife, Linda, passed away after 43 years of marriage. Nobody prepares you for the silence that comes afterward. It isn't loud, it's the opposite. It's making 2 cups of coffee before remembering you only need 1. It's reaching for the passenger door to tell someone about your day, then realizing nobody's there. People ask if you're doing okay. You smile. You tell them you're getting by. And after a while, even you start believing it. 3 years passed. My routine never changed. Every Sunday morning, I'd sit at the same kitchen table, coffee in one hand, phone in the other. I'd open my retirement account, stare at the numbers, then close it again. The balance was fine, better than fine. But for some reason, I still couldn't stop checking. One Sunday, I caught my reflection in the dark phone screen. And I remember thinking, what exactly am I waiting for? I had enough money to retire, but I wasn't really living. Somewhere along the way, I'd become so focused on protecting the life I'd built that I'd stopped building one. A few days later, I met my old friend Jim for breakfast. We've known each other since our 20s. He's the kind of friend who doesn't fill silence just because it exists. Halfway through breakfast, he looked at me and asked, "When's the last time you did something for the first time?" I laughed. At my age? Probably years. He nodded like he'd expected that answer. Then he said something that stayed with me. Maybe retirement isn't supposed to be the reward. Maybe it's supposed to be the beginning. I laughed it off, changed the subject, paid the bill, went home. But that question followed me every day for weeks. Then one afternoon, while watching random travel videos online, YouTube recommended a video about the Philippines. I wasn't looking for a new country. I wasn't looking for a new life. Honestly, I was just looking for something that made me feel curious again. I had no idea that one click would quietly change the rest of my life. I didn't tell many people I was going. Honestly, I wasn't sure why I was going myself. I booked a round-trip ticket. 3 weeks. That was the plan. Just enough time to see if all those videos I'd watched had been showing me real life, or just the highlights. Jim drove me to the airport. As he pulled up to the terminal, he looked over and smiled. "Remember, you're not moving. You're just giving yourself permission to see something different." At the time, I believed him. 20 hours later, I stepped off the plane into the warm Philippine air. Within seconds, my glasses fogged up. I hadn't even found baggage claim, and the country was already reminding me I wasn't in Oregon anymore. Everything felt unfamiliar. The sounds, the traffic, the humidity, people speaking languages I'd never heard in person before. I'll admit it. There was a moment when I wondered if I'd made a mistake. Then something completely ordinary happened. A young airport employee saw me standing there, looking more confused than I'd like to admit. He smiled, pointed me toward the right hallway. "This way, sir." That was it. No grand welcome, no life-changing speech. Just someone taking 10 seconds to help a stranger. Looking back, that little moment set the tone for everything that followed. I found a small hotel near the waterfront. Nothing luxurious, just clean, quiet. And downstairs, there was a little cafe. The next morning, I wandered in and ordered a cup of coffee. The young waiter brought it over. We exchanged a few words, mostly smiles, mostly patience. Before I left, he looked up and said, "See you tomorrow." 3 simple words. I smiled politely, walked outside. but for some reason, they stayed with me. The next few days were wonderfully ordinary. I walked for hours, sat by the water, tried foods I'd never heard of, got lost more than once. One afternoon, my phone battery died while I was wandering through a neighborhood I'd never seen before. I finally admitted to myself I had absolutely no idea where I was. An older man sitting outside a small neighborhood store noticed me studying a paper map. I expected him to point me in the right direction. Instead, he stood up, smiled, and walked with me for several blocks until he knew I was back on the right road. We barely spoke. We didn't need to. By the end of that first week, something unexpected had happened. I wasn't thinking about sightseeing anymore. Somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling like a tourist. Drinking coffee, walking familiar streets, watching the city wake up each morning. It felt strangely comfortable. Then, one Sunday, my daughter Emily called. We talked about the weather, the flight, the food, and the rooster outside my hotel that seemed determined to wake the entire neighborhood before sunrise. She laughed. Then she got quiet. Finally, she said, "Dad, you sound different." "Different how?" "Lighter." After we hung up, I sat there thinking about that one word, lighter. Maybe she was right, because for the first time in years, I realized I'd completely forgotten to check my retirement account. Not because I'd run out of money, because, for the first time in a long time, I was too busy enjoying the day in front of me. 3 weeks passed faster than I expected. Before I knew it, I was packing the same suitcase I'd arrived with. The night before my flight, I stopped by the cafe one last time. Before I could order, the waiter smiled, set a cup of coffee on the table. "One more before you go." I laughed. "You remembered?" He shrugged. "Of course." Then he smiled. "Safe trip, and see you tomorrow." I smiled back. "Not tomorrow. Maybe someday." He nodded. "We'll be here." I don't think he realized, or maybe he did, how much those words meant. Or maybe he did. The flight home gave me a lot of time to think. I kept asking myself the same question. Why did those 3 weeks feel different? I still didn't have an answer. When I landed back in Oregon, everything looked exactly the way I'd left it. The same roads, the same trees, the same cool air. Jim was waiting outside baggage claim. He loaded my suitcase into the truck. We drove for almost 20 minutes before he finally asked, "Well?" I looked out the window, then quietly said, "I think I left something over there." Jim smiled. "Or maybe you found something." Neither of us spoke for the rest of the drive. We didn't need to. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was honest. The next morning, I tried to fall back into my old routine. Coffee, grocery store, a stop at the hardware store, home before lunch. Everything was familiar, but none of it felt familiar anymore. It was like putting on an old pair of boots that still fit, but somehow didn't feel like yours. One afternoon, I stopped by the paper mill to say hello. The machines were still running. The guys were still joking around. Somebody else had taken over my old route, and they were doing just fine. Walking back to my truck, I expected to feel replaced. Instead, I felt relieved. The life I'd spent 41 years building didn't disappear because I retired. It simply kept moving, the way life always does. That evening, I found myself sitting alone on the back porch, looking across the yard, thinking about Linda, thinking about Jim, thinking about a little cafe on the other side of the world. That's when something finally became clear. I wasn't missing a country. I was missing the way I felt while I was there. The next morning, I called Emily. Then I called a realtor. 6 months later, I was back. Not for a vacation, not to see if I still liked it. This time, I was starting over. The apartment was small, one bedroom, a little kitchen, a balcony just big enough for one chair. If someone had shown it to me 10 years earlier, I probably would have thought I'd downsized too much. Funny how your definition of enough changes. The first morning, I walked back to the cafe. The young waiter looked up. For a second, he just stared. Then his face lit up. "Thomas!" He walked over and shook my hand. "You came back." 4 simple words. Somehow, he brought my coffee without asking. I smiled. "You remembered?" He laughed. "Of course." Life settled into a rhythm surprisingly fast. Mornings at the cafe, walks along the boulevard, grocery shopping, phone calls with Emily every Sunday. Some evenings were lonely. I still missed Linda. I still missed Oregon in the fall. I still missed watching my grandson's baseball games in person. Moving across the world doesn't erase the people you love. It simply teaches you new ways to stay connected. Then came one of those weeks when everything seemed to go wrong. The power went out. The internet stopped working. Rain poured for days. I sat in my apartment wondering, what am I doing here? I'll admit it, I even looked at flights back to Oregon. Not because I hated living there, because I was tired. Funny, homesickness usually arrives when you're exhausted, not when everything is going well. Just as I closed my laptop, someone knocked on the door. It was the young waiter, standing there with an umbrella and a container of chicken adobo and rice. He smiled. "You weren't at coffee today?" I laughed. "No, I wasn't." He handed me the food. "We thought maybe you were sick." After he left, I stood there for a long time, looking at that simple meal. Then I looked at my laptop. The airline website was still open. I closed it. Not because the electricity had come back, not because the rain had stopped, but because someone had noticed I wasn't there. A few weeks later, I noticed a little girl sitting outside the cafe. She was reading an English book, quietly sounding out each word. She stumbled over one sentence 3 times. I finally asked, "Mind if I help?" She smiled and scooted over on the bench. The next morning, she came back. Then another child joined us. By the end of the month, there were 6 or 7 children waiting before school. Nobody planned it. Nobody organized it. It simply became part of the morning. One day, I watched that little girl help another child read the very same words she'd once struggled with. I hadn't come to the Philippines to stretch my retirement. I'd come here and accidentally found a reason to get out of bed every morning again. These days, my mornings look pretty ordinary. I wake up before the sun, make a cup of coffee at home. Then I walk the same few blocks to the cafe. Some mornings, it's quiet. Other mornings, the streets are already full of people heading to work. Life keeps moving. That's one of the things I like most about it. As I walk through the cafe door, the young waiter looks up. We smile at each other. He doesn't ask what I'd like. He already knows. A minute later, my coffee is sitting on the table, just the way I like it. Roberto waves from his usual chair, newspaper folded under his arm. We exchange a few words, mostly about the weather, or basketball, or nothing important at all. Funny, those conversations somehow became important. A few minutes later, the children begin arriving. The little girl with the red backpack isn't so little anymore. She's helping one of the younger boys sound out a difficult word. She glances over, smiles. "Morning, Thomas." "Morning." One of the cafe workers walks over carrying a small box tied with plastic twine. "Thomas, can I borrow your knife?" I reach into my pocket, the same pocket knife Jim handed back to me the night before I left Oregon. I cut the twine, hand it back. He smiles. "Thanks. That's all." Somehow, Jim is still part of my mornings, even from the other side of the world. Just then, my phone vibrates. I glance at the screen. Another notification from my retirement account. For years, I would have opened it immediately. Today, I smile, lock the screen, set the phone back on the table. The children are laughing about something. I never do find out what. It doesn't matter. I'm smiling too. The little girl looks over. "Thomas, you'll be here tomorrow?" I look around. The coffee, Roberto, the waiter, the children, the morning sun beginning to warm the sidewalk. Then I smile. I wouldn't miss it. I used to think retirement was something you earned, something you protected, something you spent your whole life planning for. Maybe that's part of it, but I don't think that's the whole story anymore. America gave me a career. It gave me friends. It gave me my family. It gave me 43 wonderful years with Linda. Nothing will ever replace that. The Philippines didn't erase my past. It didn't solve every problem. It didn't make me forget the people I love. What it gave me was something I didn't even realize I'd been missing. Another chapter, another routine, another reason to look forward to tomorrow. Maybe that's what retirement was supposed to be all along. Not the end of a working life, the beginning of living one. Tomorrow morning, I'll probably walk back to this same little cafe. Roberto will be reading his newspaper. The waiter will already know my order. The children will bring another book. And somewhere, before the sun comes up, that rooster will remind the whole neighborhood that a new day has started. These days, I don't mind him anymore, because tomorrow is exactly where I want to be.